Anyway, hey, let's get started because that clock is actually right, and that means that we're late to get started. So we today are going to be discussing two very important characters in the book of Genesis, namely Jacob and Joseph, who is the son of Jacob. What's that? Joseph, yeah. We're actually going to start on page 31 in your book, which is not the next lesson, but it's because I kind of cut off the previous lesson. Abraham is also a very important character in Genesis, so we spent a lot of time last week talking about him. His son Isaac is important, but doesn't have a lot of stories about him. We talked about the biggest stories about Isaac have to do with Abraham, namely that Isaac was born to Abraham when he was 100 years old, and then God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham was prepared to give up even his beloved son for the sake of the Lord, but God doesn't actually like child sacrifice, so he put a stop to that once Abraham had proven his faith. The only other major story about Isaac is that Abraham sent to find his wife from among his own people back in the city of Haran. Paran, is it? I always forget. I think it's Haran. So you remember Abraham and his family went up from Ur to Haran, and this is where Abraham's father died, and Abraham was called by God back when his name was Abram to go south to Canaan. So when he wanted to find a wife for his son Isaac, rather than she be taken from among the pagan Canaanites, Abram sent a servant up back to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, which he did among God-fearing people, and brought her back down. Addison, question?
I forgot to give this to you. Where do I put it?
Okay, just save it. I'll get it after class. Jasmine? No question? Okay. Yeah, so anyway, so we're gonna, and then Isaac has twin boys, Jacob and Esau, although I named them in reverse order. Even though they're twins, there was still one came out first, and the one who came out first was Esau. He was covered with hair. Esau actually means hairy. Not many people named Esau anymore, even though there are still plenty of hairy people. Oh, I just shaved this morning, so I guess I'm not as hairy as I have been.
You got a fresh cut.
Yeah, I did, didn't I? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I came home from the confirmation retreat, and my wife was giving haircuts to our kids. So I was like, well, I'll sit in for one. So I got a surprise haircut as soon as I got home from the retreat. But anyway, Jacob came out, very interestingly, rather than just being born like a normal baby, when Esau came out like a normal baby, there was a hand grabbing his heel. And so Jacob was actually grabbing Esau's heel and was pulled out of his mother, grabbing his brother's heel. And so the name Jacob actually means he grasps the heel, and that's a kind of an idiom for he's a deceiver. He's you can't trust him. We have a similar expression in English called pulling your leg. Has anyone ever said that? Oh, he's just pulling your leg. Yeah, that means it's obviously rooted in the Bible expression, but it means the same thing. It means
so your kid could be named, I'm just pulling your leg.
That's what Jacob means. He grasps the heel. I think they changed a couple letters or something, but it sounds very similar to the phrase "he grasps the heel." You might say his name was Heel Grasper. So yeah. So we have hairy man Esau and heel grasper Jacob are twin boys. We're going to talk about them in just a minute, but first to our opening question. Think of something unfair. I see Elliot's hand up. Elliot, what's something unfair? Life. Okay, you'd be a little more specific.
That's my answer.
Okay, Jasmine.
Life.
When one of your siblings do something and don't pass up against it and you all get in trouble?
Okay, so group punishment. I'm going to call it that, right?
I have one.
Group punishment, understanding that the whole group is not necessarily in trouble, but the whole group gets punished for one person. Yeah, that's a drag, isn't it? Braden. School. What about school?
It's just unfair. We have to do stuff for no reason.
To learn.
For no reason. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll let you sit on that answer for a bit, Andrew.
When someone cheats and then they win.
Yeah, very good. When cheaters prosper, right? Yeah, the saying goes, cheaters never prosper. That saying is wrong. Cheaters very frequently prosper. It is a truth that the Bible, that people in the Bible wrestle with. Why why do the wicked prosper while the righteous suffer? But that is a thing that's not fair. Did you have one, Ivy?
I mean, she did.
You did. Or did it just get taken? No. Okay. All right, Elliot, give me a real one.
When your family gets COVID and you're not allowed to play sports.
Okay, COVID.
COVID.
Yeah, I'm just gonna write COVID because I think we all probably have something that we feel was unfair about COVID.
So put a viable answer up there and I'm proud.
Good job. Yes, a real answer, not just life or school. If there's something in particular that's unfair about life or school, I'd be happy to hear it. But you can't just throw out a whole thing and say that. So yeah, there are things that are unfair, and this opening exercise is on page 33 in your book. Sometimes life just doesn't seem fair. People cheat and get away with it. Hey, somebody read ahead in the book maybe. Bullies pick on those who are smaller and weaker, and others are punished when they don't deserve it. Hey, look at that. Boy, we're 2 out of 3 there, just reading that.
Whoa.
And this was printed before COVID, so they couldn't get that one anyway. In many of the narratives in this section, that is today's lesson, things happen that just don't seem fair. But through it all, God is present and active. He is faithful to his people even when they disobey him. He makes good come from evil, and he works in the lives of his imperfect people to continue his perfect plan to send a Savior. And I do want to re-emphasize that. The people in Genesis are imperfect, to put it delicately. They are screw-ups. Abram was an idolater and a deceiver. Isaac isn't fleshed out enough to have anything wrong with him, I guess. But Jacob is extremely deceptive, as we'll see today. Jacob's sons, a couple of them were they weren't the rapists. There was another rapist, and then we read about Lot on the confirmation retreat and all of that stuff. And I don't mean to make light of it, but there's a lot of rape in the book of Genesis, and it is all very terrible. And then in response to the rape of their sister, we're not going to read this story. 2 sons of Jacob went on a murder spree and murdered and enslaved an entire town of people because one guy raped their sister and wanted to marry her. So that's a fun story. Shame we don't get to cover it today. But in any case, yeah. Sorry, we gotta stick with the stuff that points us to Jesus and not the stuff that points us to the fact that, wow, they were really messed up. But God chooses messed up people to accomplish his work. There are no perfect people. Some people are better behaved than others, and God certainly works very well through them naturally. But it is a recurring principle in Scripture that God chooses the weak and foolish and evil things of the world to better show his strength, his wisdom, and his goodness. And nowhere is that better evidence than in the story of Jacob. So we're going to talk about Jacob. As I mentioned, Jacob is the heel grasper. So I guess here's Esau there, and here's Jacob. Little baby Jacob just grabbing his brother's heel right there. He's like, "Come on, bro, just help me out, will ya?" And so yeah. So there's hairy Esau. He was actually, they're not sure if the name Esau means hairy or red, because he was both. He had red skin and he was hairy. Yes, so hairy red Esau, and then Jacob the deceiver there. But there we go, and I'm not going to draw the rest of that picture, but here they are being born. And from the get-go, then, Jacob is a deceiver. In fact, I forgot to mention, when the two were still in the womb, Isaac's wife's name was Rebekah. Rebekah was told by God that there are 2 nations at war in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. And that's what we're going to see happening there.
Oh no!
What's that?
Oh no!
Oh no, yeah.
Oh no.
So let's see here. I'm down again at the bottom of page 31. I'm just reading that bit underneath the pot. Abraham had his servant find a wife for Isaac from his family in Haran. Marrying cousins and stuff was still not very unusual in these days, probably because we're not too far removed from Noah and the ark. So really, it's kind of slim pickings all around. And marrying somebody from your close family was a good way to assure that they had the same values as you did, that they weren't like the Canaanites who are worshiping false gods and doing other terrible things that we'll learn about in time.
Oh,
But anyway, yeah. Abraham had a servant find a wife for Isaac from his family in Haran. Isaac married Rebekah. Is that what I said, Rebecca, or did I say Rachel?
You said
Rebecca.
Okay, good. Rachel's another R name that we'll be covering today. Isaac married Rebekah. They had twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, but God told Rebekah that Esau would serve the younger twin, Jacob. Esau despised his birthright, giving it up for a bowl of stew. That's a fun story. Esau was a hunter, a manly man. Jacob was a cook, a girly man. And not that there's anything wrong with cooking, but Jacob did prefer the indoorsy kind of stuff, staying out of the dirt. So one day Esau goes out on a hunt. I say one day, but hunts back then lasted multiple days. He comes back home. He is starving. And he comes in, and Jacob is cooking delicious stew. And Esau's like, bro, give me some of that stew. I'm famished. And Jacob's like, sell me your birthright. Like, what? Sell me your birthright. Give me all of the inheritance that is coming to you from mom and dad, and I'll give you some stew. And Esau's like, whatever, bro, just give me the stew. And so he did. He gave up his birthright for a bowl of stew.
Maybe
Esau was
not brain.
yes. Esau clearly was more in the brawn and less in the brain. A birthright is your inheritance. It's the portion of your parents' property and money that is yours by right of your birth.
And the older kid always gets it.
Yeah, well, actually, in Bible times, that's a very good point. I don't know if this was true in Genesis, but under the law given by Moses later on, the oldest son in the household would get a double portion of the inheritance. Nice. So if you girls were expected to be taken care of by the man in their life, either their father, their brother, or their husband. So they weren't portioned the inheritance. It was just expected to be shared as needed. But if a household had 3 boys, the inheritance would be split 4 ways. The firstborn would get 2, and then the other 2 boys would split the other 2. So anyway, yeah. So Jacob getting Esau's birthright might have actually tripled his share of the inheritance, depending on how they were splitting. Later, Rebekah and Jacob tricked Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing for the firstborn. Right? So there's the physical inheritance, and then there's the spiritual inheritance. This blessing that comes from God was given to Abraham, passed on to Isaac, passed on to Jacob. This blessing that all nations on earth would be blessed through him, and he'd prosper and all that. And Isaac, having 2 sons, had to divide that blessing between them, and naturally was going to give the greater blessing to the older son, Esau. Well, Isaac was blind and very old and was dying, and he asked Esau to go hunting and get some game and make a delicious stew, or have Rebekah make the delicious stew. And while Esau's out hunting for days, Jacob and his mom hatch a plan where Jacob puts on these hairy gauntlets or whatever, so he feels hairy, and his mom whips up the stew just like Isaac likes it. And so Jacob brings a bowl of stew to his blind father and says, "Here I am, Dad, it's me, Esau." And his dad is like, "Well, you sound like Jacob, but you say that you're Esau, and I can feel you're hairy like Esau, and you smell like him," and stuff like that. So, all right, Esau, let's have some of that stew, and here's the blessing. And he pronounces this rich and beautiful blessing over Jacob, and then Jacob leaves the room. And then Esau comes back a little later and is like, "All right, Dad, here's your stew. Let's get that blessing going." And Isaac is like, "Oh no, what have I done?" And so he gives Esau the lesser blessing that was meant for Jacob, which includes things like "you will serve your brother all of your days" and things like that. So Jacob steals Esau's birthright by means of a bowl of stew, and which really he wasn't being that fair. I don't know if you call it stealing, but definitely some funny business. And then he steals Esau's blessing through out-and-out deception. Well, Esau is still bigger and stronger than Jacob, and so Esau is fixing to kill him. And Jacob runs away, and that's kind of where lesson 7 leaves off. Jacob has run away from home because he has tricked his brother for the last time, and his brother is out for blood.
So then does Esau still get his right, even though Jacob ran away?
His birthright? Well, that's a good point. Of course, their parents are still alive. Or I guess Isaac isn't still alive. I forget when Rebecca dies, but yeah, obviously Esau is getting what's his unless Jacob takes it by force. But the blessing, that blessing is a gift of God, and that is something that cannot just be taken back even by force. That's gone. So let's see here. Let's draw this is a nice little map here. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. There's that island of Crete or whatever. This is a very
Crete.
what's it? Cyprus. Sorry, Crete's a different island. Yeah. Here's the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, the Dead Sea. This is going to be a very routine map that I draw here. So Jacob and his family were living down at Bethel, I think. No, they were in Beersheba, which is even farther south. Way down here, Beersheba. So here is a beer stein there. So it's Beersheba, and they were living down there. And Jacob runs away all the way up to Haran, Haran. Darn it. Jacob runs all the way up to Haran, which is right about there. That's where his mother's family is from. Remember, Abraham sent a man up to Haran from Beersheba to find a wife from Isaac. And so Jacob's mom's family is from those parts. So Jacob flees from Esau to go to Haran. And let's turn to page 34 here. We've actually got a Bible reading that we're going to do here. Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 28. Genesis 28 is where we'll be reading the Bible. I am trying to zoom through this as fast as I can.
Can I read?
You can read, yes. We're
Go.
doing Genesis 28 verses 10 through 22.
10 through 22.
Yep, of Genesis chapter 28.
Excuse me, am I bad?
Yes,
Use
you are.
her bad.
I do agree, you are bad. Very common.
Funny.
Very common.
Okay, quiet down, guys. Let's hear Addison read.
Jacob left Beersheba and
Beersheba. Come on, I
Beersheba.
drew a stein and everything.
and he went towards Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. And behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord of the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to the land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in the place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on it, the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you.
10%.
Very good. Yep, there's another 10% tithe. And this green drawing that I'm doing is for the next reading. I'm getting an early setup. But anyway, yeah, so I drew a dot on the map, roughly where this place is that Jacob had his dream. And in his dream, depending on the translation you read, he sees either a ladder or a staircase We're not exactly sure what the Hebrew means there. It's one or the other. It's a way to get up and down, you know. So he sees in this dream angels going up and down a ladder to heaven, and at the top of the ladder/staircase, he sees God himself. And God pronounces the same blessing on Jacob, who is, remember, running away from the murderous rampage of his brother Esau, pronounces the same blessing on Jacob that he gave to Abram, that I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth, like the sand of the seashore, and I will give you this land. It's the same chunk of land. And so Jacob, if there was any doubt, is the recipient of the blessing given to Abraham and passed down through Isaac. And so Jacob wakes up from this dream. He'd been using a rock for a pillow because, I mean, he didn't exactly get to pack a suitcase. So, Elliot?
L.
Huh?
I'm just holding up an L.
Good job. If you hold up a YMCA, you can join the village people. So yeah, he was using a rock as a pillow, and he set this rock, I guess it was kind of long, and he set it upright to be something of a pillar, from pillow to pillar. That's a pretty good English wordplay. Doesn't match up in Greek. It was probably only like this tall. But he set up the rock that he was using when he had this dream, and he poured oil on it because that was one of the few things he did have, and that was a way to anoint something to set it apart. Remember from, I think it was just last Sunday in church, I mentioned that if something is holy, that means it is set apart for God's use. And so Jacob did the best he could in the circumstances to acknowledge what God had done for him there by setting up this pillar and consecrating it. And he named that place Bethel, which literally means house of God. Beth means house, El means God. Lechem means bread. So if you encounter a town named Bethlehem later on in the story, that means house of bread. And that's the town that Jesus was born in.
I think we did this one in Sunday school.
Bethel? Oh, the Jacob's Ladder? It's a popular Sunday school one because angels are pretty.
Oh.
So that's that story. Jacob continues all the way up to Haran then, and Jacob, it's worth noting, Jacob, of course, responds in faith. He says, if God will, what does he say? Let me read it. If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I've set up for a pillar shall be God's house. Hence the name Bethel, house of God. So Jacob does believe God, but at the same time he phrases it in such a way that it's kind of like a conditional belief. If God actually preserves me and allows me to come back to my father's house in peace, then he will be my God forevermore. In the meantime, I'm going to keep heading north. And so that's what Jacob does. He goes north to Haran, where he meets his uncle, his mother's brother. The man's name is Laban. And he works for Laban for a while. And Laban has 2 daughters. I might be getting ahead of myself here. Let's see. We're just going to skim. So this next part comes from Genesis 29.
I think I've heard this story before.
Laban has 2 daughters. The older one is named Leah, and the younger one is named Rachel. And Jacob falls head over heels in love with Rachel. She is just a wonderful girl. They are 2 of a kind. Yada, yada, yada. Here's Rachel. Isn't she so pretty? I guess I could give her a dress or something. I just don't want to keep switching colors. So there's Rachel. Jacob really loves her, and so Laban makes a deal with her. You know, back then the father was expected to. I'm just gonna say back then marriage was a more than just 2 people fall in love and get married. There was always some kind of transaction that went along with it. And Laban says, I'll make a deal. You work for me for 7 years, and I will let you marry my daughter Rachel. And Jacob says, hot dog, I can't hardly wait. So for 7 years, he works for Laban to marry Rachel. Now, Laban has an older daughter. This older daughter's name is Leah. And Laban, in his culture, and he even explains this, so it must be a unique thing even in these days, but in Laban's culture, a man who has multiple daughters should marry the older one first, like marry her off to somebody else, And his thought was that, if I hold off the wedding to my younger daughter for 7 years, surely my older girl Leah is going to find somebody to marry. Jacob did not like Leah because the Bible says she had weak eyes. I don't know what that means, but I drew her with little eyes, and Rachel with those big, beautiful eyes with the luscious lashes and everything, so you can remember the difference. So Jacob works for Rachel for 7 years, and then the big wedding day comes. Jacob is so super excited. I don't know much about wedding customs in those days, but I do know this. The bride hid her face behind a veil, and not one of these lacy little see-through veils like we use today at weddings. This was like an opaque sheet, like he could not see her face. And furthermore, when the wedding was consecrated through the sexual act that evening, it was done in a dark tent. And so Laban uses this custom to his advantage, and he actually tricks Jacob into marrying the older daughter. Because even though Jacob doesn't want to marry her, Laban wants to marry her off before he marries off the younger daughter. And so Jacob says his vows, he does the act of marriage, it is consecrated, and only afterward does he realize, wait a minute, that was Leah? So now Jacob is stuck married to a woman that he doesn't love. And of course, poor Leah is stuck married to a man who doesn't love her. And Laban says, all right, Jacob, I know you're mad, but hear me out. If you work for me another 7 years, I will let you marry Rachel now, right? So you work for me 7 years and then get Rachel, that's still good. You can have her. You just had to marry Leah first. So you marry Rachel now, and then you have to agree to work for me another 7 years. And Jacob is like, all right, fine, you crooked old man, I'll do it. So Jacob finally gets to marry the woman that he loves. Of course, he's still married to the other woman. This is polygamy. Polygamy is marrying more than one person. And it's Addison?
Rachel, is she the one that that he actually wants to marry, right?
Yes.
Does Rachel like him back?
Yes, Rachel. It's a match made in heaven or whatever. Rachel and Jacob are madly in love and all that stuff. I'm gonna put here just a reminder: L for Leah and R for Rachel. And so I want to make a little aside here. The Bible never actually says that polygamy is a good thing. God did not make Adam and Eve and Martha and Barbie and whoever else. God made Adam and Eve, one man, one woman. And in Genesis, when we do see polygamy practiced, it always ends in heartache and conflict, and it's just a mess. You remember when Abraham was given his wife's handmaiden Hagar as a second wife, but at the same time a slave, and that caused all kinds of conflict and was just a terrible idea. So, this is going to end well. So Jacob works another 7 years for Laban. He keeps up his end of the deal. The Bible says that to Jacob, it was as if no time had passed at all because he was just so in love. It's very nice. Let's see, how far are we going before our next reading? So, we talked about things not being fair, and Jacob, when his whole youth, being a trickster and a deceiver, and now he's up here, and he meets the master trickster, the uncle that he never knew he learned all of his tricks from. And so Laban, and there were some other tricky business deals that Laban did, over Jacob that we're not going to talk about, but Laban was just as dishonest as Jacob was, except he was older and better at it. And so, by the grace of God, Jacob did eventually leave Laban with the two wives and a whole bunch of animals and stuff. Caleb?
You know how you said Leah had bad eyes or whatever?
Weak eyes, yep.
Weak eyes? Her uncle is blind. Isaac is blind.
That's a good point. He is. It's her uncle by marriage, though, for what that's worth. But I guess since they were already closely related, he probably is a uncomfortably close cousin or something like that as well. But yeah, good point. I think Isaac was just old, though. let me see here. I'm going to read here at the bottom of page 34. We kind of summed up Genesis 29, 1 to 30. Jacob ended up with 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, but he loved Rachel more. This was no secret. God had mercy on Leah, though, and gave her 4 sons. Rachel became jealous because she couldn't have children. Do note that they almost certainly also had daughters here, but since this is a patrilineal record, they only record the sons unless there is some relevant story with a daughter, like the daughter Dinah. There's a nice little family tree there on page 34 in your workbook if you get confused over who's who. So you got Abraham and Sarah at the top. They have Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob. We haven't introduced Zilpah and Bilhah yet, but we're about to. Rachel became jealous because she couldn't have children, so she gave her servant to Jacob as a wife. That's Bilhah there, is Rachel's servant. So Rachel's like, well, fine, if I can't make babies for my husband, then I'll give him somebody who can, and then that'll be all better. So here's poor Bilhah, and she's just roped into this. She's just a servant. She's probably a slave, to be honest. But the the language of the Bible makes no distinction between paid servants and slaves. So I'm guessing she was a slave because, she basically just made her bear children for her husband. So Rachel gives Bilhah to Jacob, and Bilhah starts having kids. And then Leah gets jealous and is like, hey, what is this? You're upstaging me. So Leah gives Jacob her servant, who is Zilpah. So here's poor Zilpah over here, and she's probably not too thrilled either. And together, these 3 women had 10 children, or 10 boys, excuse me. They had at least 1 girl among them as well, and probably more. And then finally, God did have mercy on Rachel, and she had a son, and his name was Joseph. What about Benjamin? Yeah, she does have a second son, Benjamin, but she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. So that's a sad story. Yeah, Benny boy. So Joseph is the youngest of his brothers until Benjamin is born, and that's gonna factor in later. But yeah, if you are looking at that family tree there on page 34 in your book, there's that line of blue names underneath Jacob's 4 girls. That is his 4 wives/servants. And that line of blue names are all of the sons of Jacob. You notice there are 12 of them, and each one of them is going to become an ancestor to an entire people group called a tribe. And the tribes are named after their ancestor, the son of Jacob, except for Joseph. Joseph is an exception. We'll find that out in a little bit, but there are 2 tribes in Israel named after Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. They trace their lineage back to his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. But the rest of them are that generation. And then there are some serious gaps in this timeline. Namely, if you see underneath Levi's name, the names Moses and Aaron, that's like a 400-year gap between Levi and Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron are not Levi's sons. They are Levi's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandsons, something like that. Likewise, King David, the descendant of Judah, that would be about 900 years. And also King Saul, the descendant of Benjamin, another 900 years. And then Jesus, the descendant of King David, is another 1,000 years after King David. So this timeline is covering some serious ground chronologically. It's really only stopping briefly to acknowledge certain important people on the way down. So take that for what it's worth. And then you do see the one daughter, Dinah, there, the daughter of Leah. She is the one I mentioned, the sister who gets raped by a guy, and so 2 of her brothers go and murder an entire town full of people. So that's Jacob is not too thrilled about that because it gets him into trouble since he's kind of responsible for his kids' behavior, his adult kids' behavior. Why? Because they're a family unit, and if his kids are murderous or rampagers, then what does that say about him? And is anyone really going to want that family living nearby, grazing their sheep and stuff?
The daughter maybe they had a reason to.
Well, yeah, they were mad, and maybe they should have like executed the rapist, but they murdered an entire town. Like this is literally a whole town was just wiped out. All of the men were killed, and the women and children were taken as slaves, and whatever else they did with women and children who lost a battle in those days. Okay. We're at the top of page 35 now. Got to keep it going. After 14 years of working for his uncle, Jacob left Laban to go to his homeland. He and his uncle did not leave on good terms. Jacob was tired of his uncle trying to cheat him out of his pay, and so Jacob leaves. But Rachel steals an idol from her uncle. Because remember, this family, they did worship the Lord, but they also worshiped other gods. They were polytheistic. And so I'm guessing that Laban's idol was probably worth something. Maybe had some gold or jewels in it. So Rachel's just like, I'm just going to snag this from Dad, and he won't miss it. Spoiler alert, he missed it. And so he chased after Jacob, and Jacob didn't know about it, but Rachel did. And Rachel, taken after her husband, lies to her dad about, I didn't steal the idol. Look around everywhere. And she was sitting on the chest where the idol was being hidden, but he didn't look in that chest because she told him that it was her time of the month, and so she couldn't stand up. And yeah, true story. And so that's how she tricked her dad out of his idol. And so they are coming back down, but he was afraid that as Jacob was afraid that Esau would still be angry with him, right? Because the last time he saw Esau, he wanted to murder him, and nothing's really changed. It's not like they've been keeping in touch over the years. So he prayed to God for help, and then he made a plan. He split up his people into two groups, and he sent a gift of livestock on before him. So he sent a bunch of servants / slaves and a bunch of sheep and other livestock ahead of himself because he heard that Esau was coming up from Beersheba with an army of 400 men, and he was going to meet Jacob on the way down from Haran. So Jacob kind of sent a peace offering. It's like, here, bro, I'm really sorry about all that stuff I did. Look at all this stuff I'm giving you. You don't even need that silly old blessing anymore, right? Because you got all this stuff here. And but Esau kept coming, and so Jacob, on the night before their meeting, and if you were in church a couple weeks ago, I preached on this text. But on the night before their meeting, Jacob sends his family across the stream. There's a stream somewhere around here that they cross over to meet Esau. Sends them across, and then it's just him. He's all alone that night before he meets his brother. And that is when a man, this random guy, just shows up and starts wrestling with Jacob. He attacks him. But they're wrestling. They're not they're not clawing at each other. They're just grappling and throwing each other down and I don't know, whatever ancient wrestlers did. It's a really bizarre thing. But they wrestle all night because Jacob's got nothing to lose and this other guy is, he's just here to fight, I guess. But morning comes, where am I? In the morning, the man touched Jacob's hip socket, right about here, and put it, I've got a knife there. Well, right about here, touched Jacob's hip socket and put it out of place. So he dislocated Jacob's hip. So for the rest of his life, Jacob had to walk with a limp, which means he couldn't run anymore. Jacob was running away from the trouble he made up to Haran, and then he was running away from the trouble made for him back down south. He's out of places to run, and God says, no more running. Done. No more running. So Jacob walks with a limp from that day on. And the Israelite people, even hundreds of years later, they still do not eat the part of an animal that is on that particular hip. They don't eat the meat from that part, as a tradition pointing back to this wrestling match that Jacob had with a man who obviously must be God, because he has the power to dislocate his hip with just a touch. Recognizing that he was no mere man, Jacob asks him for a blessing. So the Lord God blessed Jacob and gave him a new name. Names have power in the Old Testament. Remember, when God blessed Abraham, he gave him a new name as well. When God changes your name, he changes your very identity. Or rather, I should say, when God blesses you, as he blessed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he alters their very identity, and so they get a new name. From that point on, Jacob is not the deceiver. What did we say? We had the leg puller, right? Jacob is no longer the leg puller. He is the God wrestler. And I don't think I have time to try to draw a guy wrestling with God. But the name Israel, Yisra means to wrestle, and El means God. So Israel means he strives with God or he wrestles with God. And that is a very telling name because Israel's descendants become a nation, also called Israel. And the whole rest of the Old Testament really is the story of how this nation wrestles with God, who just wants to love them and bless them, but they keep going after other gods. And so back and forth they go. All right, next, if you're following along on page 35, I'm at the third stopping point with the weird arrows that are going every which way. So Jacob and Esau are reconciled. Jacob, limping from his encounter with God, humbled himself as he drew near to Esau, bowing 7 times to his brother. But instead of being angry, Esau ran to meet him, weeping tears of joy and forgiveness. Let's read Genesis 33, verses 1 through 11. Who wants to read? I haven't let one of you read in a while. Braden? Genesis? Have your Bible open to the passage.
Shuts.
Okay. Maybe when we get to Psalms or something, it'll stay open.
It'll stay open.
All right, I'm going to throw this one to Elliot, but keep it open there. Use a pumpkin or something to weigh it down, and then you'll be ready. Elliot, Genesis 33, verses 1 through 11.
And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel, and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant."
Note real quick that when you're trying to humble yourself in Bible times, one way that you could do that when you're talking to somebody is you refer to yourself as your servant. So when Jacob says, "These are the children that God has graciously given your servant," he doesn't mean that like Esau has a servant somewhere who gets children. Rather, Jacob is calling himself your servant as he speaks to Esau. Keep going.
Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I have met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord."
There again, as a term of respect and submission to his brother, rather than saying to find favor in your sight, he says to find favor in the sight of my Lord, implying that you, Esau, are my Lord. Lowercase l is not idolatry here, but you know. Keep going.
But Esau said, "I have enough, my brothers. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it.
Very good. So it's a tearful reunion. Esau's like, "What's up with all these presents?" And Jacob's like, I just want you to have them, my brother." And Esau's like, "I don't need these presents. I'm rich. You don't have to do this." And Jacob's like, No, I insist." So the first ever recorded courtesy war, where a guy is giving another guy stuff, and the other guy's like, "Oh, I can't. It's too much." And back and forth. But Esau eventually takes the gift, and there is peace between them. I want to note, I skipped over the place where Jacob wrestled God. He gave that place a name. He called it Peniel, which means face of God. Penny meaning face, or pen, and El, again, meaning God,
Wait,
Peniel.
pen means
So that's why
face?
they're called.
In Hebrew, pain.
Pain.
I believe it's
I thought you
P-E-N,
said-
but the E is a long.
Ew, my pig.
Just deal with it. Peniel means face of God. And so when Jacob says that his brother's face is like the face of God, he is remembering that he just saw the face of God like a few hours ago when he was wrestling and dawn broke. So, huh?
Where's the place where they fought? God.
What?
Where was it?
Guys, quiet down. Yeah, we got a good exchange going on here. So Jacob, I don't know where it is on the map. It's somewhere around here, where Jacob wrestled with God and he saw God's face and named the place Peniel, face of God. And then he sees his brother and he says, "My brother, your face is like the face of God. Not that it's radiant and glowing, but it's loving and forgiving. It's everything that he's found God to be."
So like, you know how Jews are God's people?
In the Old Testament, yeah?
Yeah.
Sure.
So then, what's the difference between Judaism and then in Christianity?
That's a question that we'll have to answer much later in this class. But it's a little beyond the scope of today's class. We still have to cover Joseph in like 5 minutes. What do you want?
When it says that Jacob wrestled with God, did God become flesh into the form of man to wrestle with him?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So this is not God in all of his divine glory and majesty. This is God hidden in the veil of flesh. A lot of people would say this is like Jesus before Jesus had a body. Or if you subscribe to some weird theories about God existing outside of time, then it could be Jesus, the time traveler, going back with a body that had not yet been born in this timeline, but had already been born and entered into eternity and can now enter time whenever it wants. So,
That sounds like a conspiracy theory.
yeah, I mean, we don't actually know. It's a fan theory is what it is. You could call it a fan theory. It might be true, might not. We don't know. We know that the man was God. We know that it was not God in all of his divine glory and majesty that destroys sinners by the mere appearance of himself. But it was God hidden in flesh. All right, it's a good thing I gave you a good chunk of Joseph's story tonight for homework because we've only got a couple minutes to cover it. Jacob and his 4 wives had 12 boys between them. Benjamin was the youngest. Joseph was the second youngest. Joseph was the clear favorite. Remember how I said that it wasn't fair that Rachel... Girls, come on, can you focus, please? Remember how I said it wasn't fair that Jacob loved Rachel most of all? Well, when Rachel gives Jacob a son, guess what? Jacob loves the son most of all too. And it's painfully obvious to all of his brothers to the point where they get very jealous. Jacob at one point gives his son Joseph a coat of many colors. If you've heard of Joseph in the coat of many colors, or if you're into Broadway musicals, Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. That was a gift from Jacob to his son, from Israel to his son that showed clear favoritism. His brothers were jealous, and so one day when they were in the fields very far from home working the sheep and stuff, the brothers conspired together to kill Joseph. So they gang up on him and they strip off his coat and they throw him down in a well, and they're just going to leave him there to rot and die. And they kill an animal and they paint its blood on the coat, and they come up with a story where Joseph was killed by a pack of wolves. It was terrible. All we recovered was this ripped up bloody coat. And but then before they leave, some slavers go by, some guys who are traveling and in the business of slave trading, and they're like, "Hey, why should we kill our brother when we can still get rid of him and get paid to do it?" So they fish him up out of the well, and they sell him to these slavers who are on their way to Egypt. We find out later that they're Ishmaelites. So these are descendants of Ishmael. Remember that other kid that Abraham had with Hagar that never should have happened? So Ishmaelites buy Joseph from his brothers and take him to Egypt, which is like, on this map, Egypt is like way down here. And there they sell him to a man named Potiphar. Now, slavery in those days was not quite like Uncle Tom's Cabin, like the horrible slavery practices in the United States. It really was more like a servant, except you didn't have legal rights. But you were given a house, you were given food, you were treated humanely. There were obviously bad apples or whatever. But the point is that God was with Joseph, And God gave Joseph a very kind master who actually let Joseph pretty much be in charge of the whole house. So Joseph lived there freely and probably quite enjoyably. And then the master's wife tries to seduce Joseph. She's like, hey, come on and lie with me. And Joseph is like, no, lady. I'm not going to defile myself in this way. You have a husband, and I would never betray him that way. So Joseph maintains his integrity. But at one point, this crazy lady finds him alone in the house and like lunges at him and tries to get him by force. But she grabs his coat, not the many-colored coat, different coat, and he slips away. He, just kind of does one of them dodge moves where you leave your shirt behind and you run away. And so she has a shirt. So she goes to her husband and says, that servant Joseph tried to rape me. But then I yelled out real loud and he ran away, but he left behind the shirt, see? And her husband believed her. And so the one time in Genesis that a dude didn't rape somebody, he gets put in prison for a crime he didn't commit, unjustly so. But while he's in prison, he meets these two guys that worked for Pharaoh, the king. One was the chief baker, and the other was the chief cupbearer, which is the guy who tests the drink to make sure it's not poisoned. And we don't know why they were in prison, but they have these weird dreams while they're there. And Joseph is like, oh, I know what your dreams mean. And he tells them what their dreams mean. They're prophecies of future events. The events come to pass. And one of the two guys, the cupbearer, actually goes back to his position of serving Pharaoh, but he kind of forgets about Joseph for a couple years. And then Pharaoh has a dream, and it's a really weird dream. It's like these cows that come out of the river, and they're all fat. There's 7 of them. And then these 7 skinny cows come out of the river behind them, and then they eat the fat cows, but they're still skinny, and it's like this weird dream, yeah. And Pharaoh's like, I had this weird dream. What does it mean? And the cupbearer is like, hey, I know a guy. And so they fish Joseph out of prison, and Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. He says, this is what it means. The 7 fat cows mean that there will be 7 years of plenty. There will be so much food. The farmers are going to reap in all kinds of wonderful harvests. But you need to save up as much as you can, because after the 7 years of plenty, there will be 7 years of famine around the whole world. Not like the literal globe, but the whole ancient world where they're living, and you need to save up food from the fat years so that you can survive the lean years. And Pharaoh's like, wow, that's exactly what that means. Oh, tell you what, Joseph, since you got that right, I'm going to put you in charge of the food collection. During the 7 years of plenty, I want you to manage the food and get the extra stuff. And during the 7 years of famine, you're going to be in charge of distributing it. And so he does. So Joseph is made literally the prime minister of Egypt. Pharaoh says the only person in all the land who is higher than you is me. I'm Pharaoh. But yeah, you're second in command over the whole Egyptian nation. And during the famine years, Joseph's family is also starving. And they think that Joseph is long gone. But they hear that Egypt has food. So they go down to Egypt to get food. Joseph finds them. He forgives them. Just as Esau forgave Jacob, Joseph forgives his brothers. And so your memory verse for tonight is what Joseph says. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good and for the saving of many people. And so at the end of the book of Genesis, there's this wonderful family reunion, and the whole family of Israel, who is still alive, although very old, Israel and all of his sons and their sheep and servants and everything, they all move down to Egypt. And they live down there where Joseph is the prime minister. So everybody lives happily ever after. Genesis has a very pretty ending. Israel does die and pronounce a blessing on each of his sons. It's a whole thing. And Judah gets the biggest blessing for reasons we won't get into. Addison?
Will this be the last week of our Bible books? Like, naming books of the Bible?
Depending on how I feel. So, this week's memory assignment is going to be the entire books of the Bible. But I feel like I should reward you for learning them all by keeping the same assignment on for a few more times, so that you can get an easy A by just having to regurgitate things that you've already said. So don't sleep on those Bible verses, because that might be coming, but I make no promises yet. Andrew?
So, well, I guess Sunday school lied because they said Joseph became the Pharaoh.
He became the prime minister of Egypt. Yeah, one step below the Pharaoh. Don't call it a lie. Your Sunday school teacher was just a bit off. To be fair, he was almost Pharaoh, but not quite. He was just under the king. The king's not going to go and let him be king. Yeah. All right, let's say our closing prayer, and then I'll distribute homework. I promise one of these days I will get that prayer in a readable form that I want to like put a poster on the back of this board so I can just flip it and we pray together. But otherwise, try to memorize it. Here we go. I thank you, my heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have graciously kept me this day. And I pray that you would forgive me all of my sins where I have done wrong and graciously keep me this night. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul, and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen.